today, I have the privilege to be up here to share on the final installment of I'm Here by talking about lessons from Samuel. And yes, the Bible character that resonated with me and spoke to me while I was in Penang was the prophet Samuel. And of course, we turn our Bibles to First Samuel. And if you're there, you can say yes, so I know you are there. And if you're a new friend, just peek over to your friend next to you. Okay, great. So the life of Samuel is a really long one, spanning across 31 chapters in First Samuel alone. He was one of the few whose whole life was kind of recorded somewhat in details in the Bible, starting from his miraculous birth. Okay, Hannah, Hannah, his mom was barren and cried out to God for a child, to which God answered, and she dedicated Samuel to God to be raised and to serve in the temple. And Samuel was a faithful young servant who obeyed God through his youth and became the leader of the people. However, if you read on, you will realize that he was in and he led in I would say, difficult time of Israel's history. Or for the matter, there's a lot of difficult time in the Bible, in Israel's history. So how challenging, maybe you will ask, how difficult it is. Maybe we can put ourselves in his shoes for a moment. So the first difficulty in his time was that God's voice was so rare in his time. 1 Samuel 3:1, you can just flip over. It says that the Lord's word was rare at that time and visions weren't widely known. So God didn't speak very often. So much so that when God actually first spoke to Samuel, when he was a young person, nobody recognized that it was God speaking. The hearts of the people were hard, were difficult, and corruption was kind of rampant in the church. That was the first one. The second difficulty was at a point of time, there was a war kind of going on. The Philistines fought against Israel and defeated Israel. So it was a sad day for Israel because God's ark was captured. 34,000 people died. Eli, which is Samuel's leader, Israel's previous priest and judge, died as well. His sons died, Eli's sons died in the battle. And it was only 24 years later that the people started looking for God again. 24 years is a really long time. And Samuel led the people to pray and to turn their hearts towards God. And under his leadership, the Philistines were defeated and territories were returned to Israel. So it was a really prolonged time of, people not exactly really following God. And there was a war going on. The third difficulty was Samuel's two sons were corrupted. His own sons, who were supposed to succeed him to lead Israel, right? They were corrupted. The Bible said they accepted bribes and perverted justice. Any more? Yes. The people rejected Samuel's leadership and demanded a king like other nations. So Samuel was actually Israel's last judge and first prophet. He led the people into a transition to a new form of governance. And he took on a new role to the people. So there was a lot of changes going on. And his first appointed king Saul disobeyed God. Saul was not honest, and instead of admitting it was his wrong, he shifts the blame to blame other people. And we know that Samuel grieved over Saul because he loved him and he wanted him to be a godly king, but he was not. And then, next one, oh my gosh, it's a long list, right? Samuel's appointed God's second chosen king, David, to be Israel's next king. But he never lived to see the establishment of David's leadership. So Samuel's last days were obscured by conflict between Saul and David. Saul was Saul was after David, and David was on a run from Saul's attempt to take his life and kill him. And then through that whole journey in the Bible, in chapter 25, it says Samuel died and he passed away in the middle of this whole conflict that's going on. So I was thinking to myself, right, if I was in his shoes, I might be devastated and disappointed and broken, because it was a challenging climate with a lot of pushback from the people, a lot of conflicting voices, a lot of opinions, and a lot of complaints. Everything but God's voice and direction. And the question I keep thinking is, how did he keep going? How is it that he hears God every single time and time again? How is it that he's able to obey God time and time again under this kind of stress and under this kind of climate, right? So I'm going to give you my 3 observations about Samuel, why God could use him and move through him to do his work, and above all, how God was with him throughout his whole life. And that's my prayer and desire too, right? That we all have a genuine connection with God that transforms us, that despite circumstances in our world, how challenging, how difficult, how opposing it may be, to be able to hear God time and time again, and to be people whom he can use for a good cause and a good purpose. So, ready? So the 3 observations, the first thing is to hear God's voice. So God's voice was always present in Samuel's life. He was always able to navigate every stage of his life and challenge with his voice. When he was confronted by the people's demands, right, he went to pray and went to Saul, God's voice. When Saul failed as a king, God's voice was there. God was speaking to him. When Samuel was discouraged, God spoke to him. When there was no leader for Israel, the next leader, God spoke to him as well. So we know that God's voice is important. We know that we need God's voice. But the deeper question is, how do we hear? How do we recognize God's voice? How do we have God's voice, right? So let's go back to Samuel's first encounter with God to see if we can find some clues, right? So 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 1 to 10. Okay, it says that now the boy Samuel was serving the Lord under Eli. The Lord's word was rare at that time, and visions weren't widely known, right? We know this. One day, Eli, whose eyes had grown so weak he was unable to see, was lying down in his room. God's lamp hadn't gone out yet, and Samuel was lying down in the Lord's temple where God's chest was. The Lord called to Samuel, "I'm here," he said. And Samuel hurried to Eli and said, "I'm here. You called me?" Then Eli replied, "I didn't call you. Go lie down." So he did. And again, the Lord called Samuel. So Samuel got up, went to Eli and said, "I'm here. You called me?" "I didn't call, my son," Eli replied. "Go and lie down." Now, Samuel didn't yet know the Lord, and the Lord's word hasn't yet been revealed to him. A third time, the Lord called Samuel. He got up, went to Eli and said, "I'm here. You called me?" Then Eli realized that it was the Lord who was calling the boy. So Eli said to Samuel, "Go and lie down. If he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, your servant is listening.'" So Samuel went and lay down where he had been. Then the Lord came and stood there, calling just as before, "Samuel, Samuel." And Samuel said, "Speak, your servant is listening." You know, as I was reading this, it's very interesting because it seems to me that Samuel learned how to respond before he starts to recognize. And before God actually continues speaking to him. 3 times God called Samuel, but neither did God reveal himself, neither did Samuel recognize God. And for the matter, Eli also didn't really knew it was God speaking. So Samuel had to learn how to respond to God. And this guides his posture in all of his future encounters with God growing up, such that even under climate where God's voice is rare, people's hearts were difficult, a lot of troubles were swirling, he was able to have God's voice and have a walk with him. So how should we come to God? How should we respond to God, right? Now the question is like, we're questioning every line. So what do we do? So Eli gave Samuel some tips in verse 9. Eli said to Samuel, go and lie down. If he calls you, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. How should we respond to God? We got to avail ourselves for God to speak. So Eli told Samuel, right, go and lie down. Go and make yourself available for God to speak to you. So pre-gathering prayer, your own quiet time, CG meetings, prayer, gatherings, these are all examples of when we make ourselves available for God to speak. Availing ourselves for God is a habit that we all got to learn. The younger, the better. Because, why? Because life just never gets any less busier, if you realize. It gets busier year on year somehow. And somehow the older we get, the more distractions there is as well. So we got to make it a habit to avail ourselves. And it's also easy, right, to be busy with God's work, aka serving people, serving ministry, being on duty, which is, by the way, really, really awesome, right? You know, sometimes I look at you guys, I look at our people, right, that I find that after gathering, before gathering, during gathering, that you guys are way more busy than I am. I was like, wow, this person is like shuffling through and fro. Very busy, which is awesome, right? So the thing is, you know, although we may avail our time for CG and avail our time for gathering, but we need to also avail our hearts. We got to avail our hearts as well. So can I share some stories? So there are many times where I would come in for ministry on worship team early in the morning the worship team comes into church at 8 a.m. in the morning, right? And sometimes there are times where I'll come in the office in the afternoon, in the weekdays, and I will catch some of you guys like praying in a corner. I remember one time I caught Vivian praying in the studio after a long day at school and a long day at ministry, and then she just plonked herself at one corner and she was praying and worshiping. I would see Cheryl worshiping God with a guitar while practicing for the weekend. I'll see Jiao Wu at the pool's table praying in tongues. Sometimes in the morning, he will come like earlier before the worship prep, and then he will stand there with his earphones plugged in, and then he will sing with his whole heart, enthusiastically worshiping and praying. I will see Edwin. Edwin usually praying in one of the rooms, but you will hear him. He's here. And I will see Juhao praying behind his drum shield because he's trying to complete his prayer hours for worship team. But he's praying, okay? So, and you know, some of these people, they are busy with work, with school. And they have more than one ministries that they are serving in. But yet, I always see them making time to avail their hearts to God. Either before ministry, maybe a little short break in the ministry, or after gathering, they will have a little moment where they talk to God. There's something really heartwarming and inspiring watching people having a sincere moment with God. Reason being because it's a moment of like no pretense. It's just you and it's just God. You're not raising your hands to fit into the congregation. You're not trying to attract or impress anybody. You're not distracted by people all around you. So, you know, I want to encourage you, if you have not had a private moment with God where it's just you and God, I highly encourage you to have one. If you have been busy with work, school, or life or ministry, I encourage you to make yourself available. Find a space in church and have a solid 15 minutes, 30 minutes with God. Spend time just being alone with Him. I think one of the many blessings for some of us who grew up in church is that for the last many, many years, right, is that it is easier for us to avail our time for God. Because it is a habit that we formed when we were young, that we can kind of always go back to. All of us have gone through the phase of having to wake up at 5 a.m. when we were 14 to try to have a conversation with God. All of us have done that. We all have set alarm clock at 4:30 a.m., 5 a.m., and then we'll text each other, are you awake? Are you, talking to God right now? I think all of us have at least done quiet time with every single person in our Connect group once on our own. Either in church, at somebody's house, in school, or some corner. And the best part of it is not just are we able to avail our time, but I find that it is easier, not always, but it's easier for some of us to avail our hearts for God. We have been coming to church in the past, right? We've come to church in the morning at 7 a.m. And we would have a prayer meeting with pastor from 7 to 9 o'clock. I remember every single weekend. Back then, church was smaller. So we will have moments where we are on duty like every single week. And then before our duty, we will meet pastor to pray and to worship together. And we were, been through that whole phase of like praying, trying to focus, distracted, a bit hungry, a bit sleepy, a little bit distracted, falling asleep already, and then suddenly jerking awake. And then trying to pray, trying to focus, and trying to look like we are trying to, we've been through that whole entire phase and long hours of praying and focusing on God. So much so that when we do have to still our heart nowadays to kind of talk to God, I would say that it is easier because we've done it before and it's familiar. So Samuel, in the same way, he has learned to make himself available for God to speak since young. So whenever God do speak to him, right, even in the midst of like all the chaos you can imagine, right, the war going on, the people, and then his sons, and then everyone, like, oh my goodness, right? He was able to avail his time and avail his heart to hear, to obey, and to keep going. So I want to encourage you, form a habit of making yourself available. Start with something manageable. I mean, like, even though I'm sharing with you, we have done 2, 3, 4, 5 hours of prayer before personally, but you don't have to go to 5 hours. Start with 15 minutes, start with 30 minutes, start with an hour. Okay? We have got to learn to meet God at his level, at his time. Okay? So that's the first thing. We got to learn to avail ourselves. The second response that we got to have is we got to be humble. So Eli says to him that if he calls you, say, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. So no matter what the situation was, Samuel was able to come to God in humility to listen to what God has to say. So what is humility, right? What is humility? Humility means that I don't know everything. Coming to God in humility means, God, I don't know everything, but you know. And so I'm here to listen to what you've got to say. So the truth is, we don't know everything. We are not God. Even if you are 25 and you think that you've seen the world and you've seen everybody out there, no, you haven't. Even if you are 50 years old, okay, none of us 50, 40 years old, 30 years old, and you think that you have experience, you think you know better now, sometimes you don't. Every time you think you know better, you are nowhere near knowing at all. So let me say this, that, there are times where your feelings really feel legitimate. Really feel like, my feelings, I really feel this way. Really, really, very strongly. And for that matter, our feelings have never lied to us all the time. Our feelings is always legitimate to us. Your thoughts may sound logical in your head. The situation you are in may look really, really terrible from your perspective. But coming to God in humility means to tell God, God, this is how I feel right now. These are my thoughts. This is my situation. But you know better. You know better. So speak to me. Here I am. I'm listening. Personally, for me, seasons in my life when it's very difficult, I can feel very overwhelmingly highs and lows. I'm a very emotional person. Maybe I don't look the part, but sometimes I say this as a joke, right? Because I really don't look emotional, but I am very emotional. I have a lot of thoughts that ends in all sorts of kind of conclusion, in all sorts of direction, and it can get such a mess in my heart and in my mind when I'm low. One thing that really helps me is whenever I come to talk to pastor or talk to PC, talk to my friends, right? I am real with them about how I feel at the moment, my thoughts, my mess. I will tell them. And I will tell them what is going through at the moment. But I will also tell them, and they will also sometimes remind me that what I'm feeling, what I'm seeing, what I'm thinking, they may not always be true. They may not always be true. And that's been very, very helpful for a very emotional person. That I don't know everything. So I'm open to listen to what God, I am open to listen to what they have to say. So always remember that your feelings are real, right? You feel a very strong, intense, I don't know, all kinds of feelings. But they may not always be true. Our situations are real, right? Our problems are real. But how we see them may not entirely be true. So it's okay to acknowledge your feelings. Be real with yourself and how you're feeling and what you're thinking. But always remember that they may not always be true. So funny story is, I just came back from Japan with Christine, right? And she has such a fun time with all the theme parks. She loved the theme parks. She loved all the rides. And she told me that she needed to do a short little journal about the day before she forgets. And she was telling me that because humans' memory can be so terrible. She was trying to recall, what did I do yesterday? And we were at a theme park the day before. So we were at another theme park and she was thinking, yesterday, what did we write on? So, because humans' memory can be so terrible. How we remember, how we feel about today can change tomorrow. You can Instagram and say, today is awesome, tomorrow you look back, no, yesterday was terrible. Right? And then 1 month later, it can change again. And 2 years down the road, it will change again. So you may not know everything. Come in humility, right? Another thing about humility is humility means I know in part. I'll explain to you. When God speaks to us, He's speaking to us for that time and for that moment. We are not called to know it all, but merely a part. And to be a part of the big story that God is doing. So I remember one time I was really discouraged about people. Very emotional. Okay, maybe not discouraged. Emotional about people. Why, people come and then people go, right? And my emotional self was like, why does this thing happen? Maybe I should have done this better. Maybe I should have done that. Maybe I shouldn't have done this, and maybe I shouldn't have done that. Maybe I should have said this, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Okay, and it was all sorts of this kind of thoughts. And I was thinking to myself, on hindsight, this person left. What's the point? Maybe we shouldn't have done all this stuff at the start. Anyway, something like that. But I remember God stopped me in my loop and in my tracks, and He told me, He said, you did this because I spoke to you, remember? And I just have all the flashback of the moments that I prayed for the person. God spoke to me to encourage them. God spoke to me to, speak some truth into their life. And God reminded me, say, you did this because I spoke to you. And God reminded me that sometimes we are in people's life in that moment, for that season. So don't be fearful and don't be too disappointed. Do and say what God is speaking to you. We don't know the entire journey of people's lives, right? Neither do we know our own journey. We know a part and we know in part. We are not in control of the outcomes of things. So don't get caught up with the outcome of things more than we are committed to rise up in the moment and in the season. So whatever God is speaking to you, do. Whatever God is telling you, do. So the amazing thing about Samuel was that he had in every situation learned to come to God and say, speak to me. And Samuel only knew in part. He did not know everything. I don't think he knows, okay? I think he knows a little bit, but I don't think he knows everything that is going to happen. But what he did was he was able to be called into moments. He was able to be called into moments and rise up in the moment. So I want to encourage you, learn to approach God with availability, learn to approach God with humility. Okay? Next observation. Second observation is Samuel was faithful in doing God's work. So be faithful in doing God's work. So I know faithfulness just doesn't sound very sexy. It sounds weird coming from me, I know, but faithfulness just doesn't sound great. Like, wow, right? New adventures, new things, starting something new, those are like fun, exciting stuff. But faithfulness, doing the same thing every other week, living by the same thing, following through the same routine and rhythm of things, doesn't sound that exciting. But faithfulness is incredibly powerful. Sometimes I think that there's more faith in faithfulness. Don't you think so? That it takes more faith to give renovation fund for the 5th consecutive year than it is for the first time. It takes more faith to serve enthusiastically. I think for those of you who have been serving faithfully for the past 1 year, you can agree with me, right? It takes more faith to serve enthusiastically now that it's been a year than your first duty that you're on. It takes more faith to love and believe your 80th new friend that stepped through the door. This is the 80th face that you're saying, hi, nice to, welcome to TiVo, and you're getting to know them. Then it is your first friend. So if you're someone who's faithfully serving, faithfully giving, and faithfully loving, congratulations, you are people of faith. Give yourself a pat on your back. Give your neighbor a pat on the back. And for all of you faithful people, right, let me encourage and remind you that when you first encounter God, when you serve for the first time, when you give for the first time, you may feel this surge of emotion and this excitement, this jitteriness that comes with being the first time, right? But when the feelings fade as you start to serve more, give more, do more, you lose the feeling of novelty. But don't be mistaken, you haven't lost your faith. Your faith had always been there. And in fact, your faith strengthens as you remain more faithful. Your faith strengthens. You may not feel your faith tangibly like the first time, right, that you're stepping out. But your faith is stronger the more faithful you are. So Samuel was faithful. What was he faithful in? So he was faithful in reminding the people of Israel to prioritize God. For many years, Samuel kept reminding the people to return to God. So 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 3 he says, Then Samuel said to the whole house of Israel, if you're turning to the Lord with all your heart, then get rid of all the foreign gods you have. Set your heart on God. Worship Him only. 1 Samuel 12:20 he says, But Samuel answered the people, don't be afraid. You have done all this evil. Just don't turn back from following the Lord. Serve God with all your heart. Don't turn aside to idols that can't help you or save you. The Lord won't abandon His people because the Lord has decided to make you His very own people. Samuel was faithful in reminding people, God loves you and you got to love God. He was also faithful in his ministry. This guy is really faithful in his ministry. He preached, he judged, he prayed, he guided Israel for over 60 years. And it's amazing at a point of time in history for him to keep preaching God's word and keep pointing people back to God. With the kind of opposition and the kind of disagreement, and the kind of war that's going on and people dying and people just complaining and people are corrupt, for him to faithfully do that for 60 years. What's powerful was, let me tell you what's powerful, was that although the biblical record is scant, right, Samuel may have founded a center or school at Ramah to train young common men in prophetic service. Because later, during the time of Elisha, schools existed at Bethel, Jericho, possibly Gilgal, where these men were called the sons of prophets. So the training of these young men led the people to walk and honor God in their lives. So even though his own sons were disobedient, even though King Saul was disobedient, even though there was a lot of challenges and the Israelites are kind of changing the way that they're governing, he had not let discouragement overwhelm him from doing what is good, from continuing doing what is right, and continuing being faithful to training the people and teaching and bringing them back to God. So with that, I want to encourage us that sometimes the greatest act of faith is your faithfulness. Staying committed to God and to His ministry. God is not calling us into perfection, but He's called us into faithfulness. Right? At the end of the day, if you read the Bible, that when we do meet God face to face one day, that God will say to us, "You good and faithful." Yeah. So God is looking for our faithfulness. And I would say rightly so, because faithfulness might be the best evidence of our faith. So what is something that you've got to be faithful to God about? And what is something that you've got to be faithful to His ministry about? And I want to encourage Tivo, let's continue to be faithful in doing what's good. In teaching and training what's right and what's important, even in challenging, difficult circumstances and climate. All right? That's number 2. The third observation is Samuel had compassion for others. And I thought this was very powerful. So have compassion for others. Samuel labored throughout his life for the welfare of the people. So he had compassion for God's people. More than anything, he desired them, for all of them to love and to fear God. To be righteous, to be kind, to be good people. Samuel kept praying for God's people and reminded them again, time and time again, to love God. And we read about this in 1 Samuel chapter 12, right? It says, "I would never sin against the Lord by failing to pray for you. I will teach you what is good, what is right. Fear the Lord and serve Him faithfully with all your heart. Look at all the great things that He has done for you." Samuel prayed for the people. He interceded for them. He encouraged them. He reminded them about God and what is good. He had a heart which really cared for the people. See, in our own journey of calling, of purpose, of life, to keep loving God and to keep loving people, right? We got to develop compassion. Without compassion, we will become angry human beings. We will become self-righteous. We will become. Because we will think that we are always right and we cannot see things from another person's perspective and that people can never live up to our expectations. And we will give up at some point in our journey with God, in our journey in the ministry. So what is compassion? Compassion is the capacity to suffer with others. The word passion comes from this Latin word called pati, meaning suffering, enduring. So compassion means compassion, right? So it means to suffer with. So as a role of a leader, I find this personally the most challenging part. Because to suffer with others means that I will see the best, but also the worst of people. And you cannot go back, meaning to say you cannot unhear stories that you have heard. You cannot unknow the kind of evil and abuse that have been perpetrated on people dear and close to you. You cannot unsee images of destruction and violence. You can't go back once you've known something has happened. You have to hold that reality of human pain in your heart. And this pain can be overwhelming, personally for me. It's the kind of pain that keeps me up at night for many nights. It's the kind that, for me, I can feel like it's a stone on my heart for weeks on end. So let me say this, that you shouldn't live your life in pain all the time. You shouldn't. That sounds very painful, right? A stone on my heart. You shouldn't be in pain all the time. If you're physically in pain, you need to see a doctor soon. All right? You cannot be in pain 24/7. That would be too miserable. But the hard truth is that your life cannot be without pain. Your life cannot be without pain. And I speak this to myself as much as I speak to, especially some of you here, that you have to let pain into your heart and grow a capacity for suffering. Because only in suffering with others do you deeply connect with others. And most importantly, only when you suffer with, then will we truly be transformed inside out. So I remember one powerful thing Pastor shared with TiVo, right? CJ shared TiVo during COVID 2 years ago. She said this, that, and COVID was 2 years ago. Yeah, COVID was 2 years ago. I was like, isn't COVID still ongoing, right? She said this, that, there are times that you need to take a break from bad news and bad press, right? You can't be on the news 24/7 reading like the terrible things that are happening in the world all the time. But there are times where you need to lean into discomfort. You need to lean into difficult conversation. You need to lean into pain. Because only then do your heart get exposed and feel something. And do you really transform? And do you really make a difference? You can only develop compassion in close proximity with somebody. And that means you have to take the time to step into another person's shoes. You have to step into another person's world. And that means that you have to let that pain and that suffering get to you sometimes. So I love what Bob Goff says. He says that when I say I don't have time, what I really lack is compassion. It's a bit fierce. People own watches, love owns time. That you got to make time for others. You got to make time for not just what's comfortable and what is your priority and what it feels safe to you, safe place, safe home. You got to make time for something a little bit outside of that. So I want to encourage you, step outside your realm of comfort, your realm of familiarity, to connect with others. And perhaps with people who are different from you, whom you really feel a little bit not so comfortable with, to lean in and sometimes look pain straight in the eyes and in the face. Don't avert pain, because it is an opportunity and is a doorway for transformation and for growth. So to wrap up, to recap, is that let's always have God's voice. To keep walking with God, to keep, living out your purpose and living out your life in God, you got to have God's voice. There's no other way around it. You got to have His voice. You got to be faithful. You got to be faithful, even under difficult circumstances and challenging times, to be faithful to do what is good and to do what is right. So I know that when we read in the Bible, we go, wow, this is amazing and this is awesome. But when in real life, it is challenging. When all the voices around you is saying otherwise. When there are a lot of pressures and peer pressures, all kinds of pressures pulling you away, and you're like, oh, what should I do? Those are the times that you got to be faithful. Yeah, you got to be faithful to God and to His ministry. And lastly, you got to have compassion. Okay? To keep walking with God, to keep living out your life, we got to have compassion. Amen?